Okay, so welcome to the discussion of the common schools in Chapter 3 with Tozer. Um, this hopefully will help you quite a bit to lay the groundwork for your media analysis of freedom riders and also to get a better understanding of some of the politics with public education today. Now, the first reading reaction paper, I'm sure, is going to be a bit of a challenge just because it's the first one. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what are people looking for? What do you need? In general, when we're talking about how the reforms tied into the status of workers, the needs of workers, as opposed to the perspective of industrialists, basically what we want to understand is how does classical liberal ideology combine with the concrete political or economic interests of particular groups in order to drive particular decisions? So, an example would be if I'm an industrialist, I may see the world through a classical liberal lens, meaning I have faith in reason, I believe in progress. I think maybe natural law put me up here in the top and put other people down here. But I also just have very practical interests in maintaining that structure. I have very clear economic benefits to be derived from viewing some people as just naturally deficient and viewing myself as superior. So those two things are very related. And that becomes important to understand. So, in a general sense, when you're thinking about your reaction paper, it would be good to tie those two things together, to realize, in other words, that ideology does not operate outside of a context. It's just part of the context, and that quite often people's material interests are connected to the way in which they interpret this ideology. So to help us get started, we're going to take a look just at some clear learning goals to help focus our attention in our conversation. The first thing is to start us off actually revisiting our Chapter 2 conversation, which was discussing quite often the tension between freedom and order during the post-revolution time period. Now, to understand this tension fully, we have to go back to classical liberalism and really figure out how are people seeing the world? How does this tie into democracy? How does this tie into the economy at the time? How does this all fit together? So, first of all, we have to revisit classical liberalism and understand that this idea of freedom is very much tied to a faith in reason. That the extent to which someone can self-govern is very much tied to the extent to which they can use their intellect, that they can think for themselves, they can think critically, they can be well-informed, they can make good decisions. The extent to which you are intellectually free, in other words, is the extent to which you are capable of being politically free. That matters quite a bit because that is very much also connected to natural law. And natural law kind of ranks and sorts nature. And it says some parts of nature occupy this position, some occupy this position. When you apply that to people, it becomes very problematic because basically what you do is you layer that logic over existing inequalities or systems of oppression. So, for example, it's no surprise that natural law would say that women are less intellectually capable than men because socially, politically, and economically, they're subordinated in almost every sense during this time period. So, using that intellectual argument, then you kind of rationalize that subordination by saying, well, women aren't fit to self-govern. They don't have the intellectual capability to choose for themselves. Therefore, we need to decide for them. We also see that as a rationale for slavery, Indian removal, you name it. So it's just very important to understand that connection. That natural law is basically saying there's a ranking, a hierarchy to the world, and that's appropriate, that's part of nature. Intellectually, then we're saying, well, we have a faith in reason, so we believe that people can kind of develop and move forward and get out of some of these places, but that there are limits to this. So there is some movement, there is this faith that education can change your situation, similar to Jefferson's natural aristocracy. However, just like with his natural aristocracy, there are limits, okay? So to bring this all back to that first learning goal, people are interpreting this very differently. People at the bottom of that natural law are very much aware that this is an ideology that's used to rationalize their oppression because they are intellectually capable. They are analyzing the problems of their own lives. And so they see very clearly that this kind of belief system is naturalizing their exclusion. So you can see a lot of pushback there. In the Common School chapter, that pushback takes place between workers and industrialists, where industrialists are framing workers as people who are just in need of more authority, in need of more managerial guidance, in need of more socialization. And workers are saying, you have a systematic economic inequality happening in our society. The reason that we have these problems is because you've structured the economy in a way where it's almost impossible not to have inequality. Therefore, when we have huge pockets of poverty, that should not be a surprise. So there's very different perspectives happening, and in this sense, that dominant ideology really helps to kind of naturalize or mask the systemic human-made causes of these inequalities, and that becomes really important. So that push for order is basically a push to stabilize that bottom-up recognition that it's the system that's unequal. Pushing for order, in other words, is trying to maintain the status quo. It's trying to prevent complete social restructuring, which in this time period is a little easier than after the revolution, but still very difficult, because you have to understand that celebrating the revolution basically said if you have an unequal system, you have a right to resist it and overthrow it. So when you teach people that logic, you have to be very careful, because if they don't like your system, they may follow that logic a little too closely. So that's where that socializing into order, into status quo, into an American identity comes into play as a social stabilizer. So in that sense, we can move to the second learning goal, which is to understand social reproduction. So a lot of the socialization that people are looking for inside the school, from an elite perspective, a lot of the socialization they're looking for is to get people to accept their current position in broader society. In other words, if you're a worker, accept this idea that that's appropriate, and that it's only through individual hard work that you could possibly get the American dream and improve your situation. It's not appropriate from that socialization point of view to go on strike or to collectively resist the economy as a whole. Instead, it's only appropriate to defer gratification, work hard, and try and accumulate a little wealth at a personal level. At the same time that people were, that elites were interested in using the schools for social reproduction, they also quite often were interested in using school for social reform. So that quite often took on the guise of values or behaviors that were better suited to an industrial economy, or that would create more stability in the social realm. So some of the socialization included temperance, which meant really moderate use of alcohol. It included certain ways of bathing, of organizing your household, of having a family structure, of, for industrial morality, certain ways of behaving at work where you're passive, a bit more subordinated to your manager or administrator. So it was getting people to adapt themselves to the institution, whether that be the school or the factory. And then the last part, which we've already kind of mentioned, is just to understand how people are located and how that influences the way in which they interpret liberal ideology and the way in which they want to engage with this idea of a system of public schools. Quite often, workers have a very different idea of what schools could be for than an industrialist does or a social reformer did. And all of these are due to the different interests and social locations that all of these people have.